The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 10. Treachery and Tournaments. Early summer 1994. When it had all happened several years before, he thought he was dead. It had been drawn out, torturous and painful, just as he always knew it would be. His body and soul writhed in agony. Everything felt raw and ablaze, as though he were on fire. He had no idea what had happened. His only thoughts were of the intensity of the pain and his need to escape from it. He had flown, twisting high in the air, screaming soundlessly into the wind, adrift on a wave of torturous affliction. He had no idea how long or how far he had gone, only that no matter when or where it was, there was only anguish. And then he was no longer flying, but laying exhausted, somewhere far from where he began. He did not know how long he lay there, or even what state of being or non-being he was in. He was, and that seemed to matter for something, though for what he could not be sure. And so he stayed there, hardly sentient, a dirty, ugly thing, like maggots under a rock, or mouldy sludge in a landfill. And then she came. Her beautiful, dry, warm skin was firm to the touch, and he found that he had a sense of touch, which delighted him. Nothing had delighted him in so long. She burrowed beneath him and laid an egg. He caressed it, cared for it as his own, because it was his own. He was more aware now, and he came to realize that he was both inside and outside of the egg. He and the egg became one. He could hear things now, whispers, barely intelligible, then stronger, as he developed his ability to hear again. "Master," she said, and it pleased him. He tried to answer, but found he had no voice. He kept trying. After some time, there was something that could pass for sound, a grunt or a groan, the sound of a creaking door, or a body being dragged across the ground. And then a word. "Home!" A direction. She burrowed beneath him again, and he learned that he was no longer just that dirty, ugly thing, that amorphous collection of misery and maggots. He slunk down into her gratefully, relaxed upon her powerful body, as she began to slither northward, home. Early autumn 1994. Draco's 4th year at Hogwarts was not off to a great start. Granted, he and the rest of the student party weren't being swarmed by Dementors at every turn. Cornelius Fudge had given up on capturing Sirius Black, at Hogwarts at least. And so far, the year hadn't had any of the craziness like the opening of the Chamber of Secrets, or the pitfall of losing the Quidditch Cup like in his 2nd year. But the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was a lunatic, stomping around on his wooden leg, crazed, roving eye scaring the hell out of everyone. And they'd been told that there would be no Quidditch tournament this year, something that was a great disappointment to nearly everyone. Draco had been hoping for a rematch, that might erase a bit of the embarrassment from last year. Add to all of this the more complex and delirious hormones that came with their early teens. When had every girl gotten so hot, for Merlin's sake? And the year was starting rather squirrely for Draco. But since Halloween night a few weeks ago, something new arrived to occupy the thoughts of the students, as often seemed to happen at Hogwarts on that night. The Triwizard Tournament commenced. This whole tournament nonsense was taking a lot of Hermione's focus, and if there was one thing that Draco Malfoy had newly discovered that he liked, it was having the focus and sole attention of his... was she his girlfriend? They hadn't really talked about that. They had kissed again the night after the World Cup behind the Malfoy tent, longer this time, and without the untimely arrival of his elf. But the next morning, Hermione and her parents went directly back to their house from the campgrounds after breakfast, and since being back at school she had been rather shy and reserved around him. They had held hands under the table in the library as they read, but the handful of nights that he had managed to walk her back to her common room, they had been either accompanied by or had encountered a crowd of Gryffindors, and he could tell that she did not want to be put on the spot. Then the week of Halloween came, and with it the start of the Triwizard Tournament. The shift in focus for practically everyone in the school had started with the arrival of the two delegations from Durmstrang and Beauxbaton. Everyone in the great hall, it seemed, had turned to stare as Victor Krum made his way into the entrance hall with the rest of the Durmstrang group. Draco's chest had puffed out when it came time for them to sit down at the welcoming feast. The dark, brooding boy and the others from Durmstrang made their way towards his section of the Slytherin table. It was true, meeting Victor in the minister's box at the World Cup probably made Draco a familiar face, but he could not help but smirk at the fact that the boy had also met Potter and the Weasleys, but did not have any desire to sit with them. The next day, it was time to pick the 3 school champions. No one was especially surprised by the 3 that had been chosen. Fleur Delacour of Beauxbaton was by far the prettiest, most enigmatic girl most of them had ever encountered, and if there was someone from the Durmstrang contingent who looked as though he was made to compete in the Triwizard Tournament, it was Victor Krum. And, of course, Cedric Diggory, Hogwarts prefect, Quidditch captain, and likely head boy next year. Draco had heard plenty of rumors about how he didn't need magic to make girls chase after him. The applause and table discussion for the 3 of them had been effusive. But then Potter's name emerged from the goblet of fire as well, and the entire school erupted into noise for a different reason. There had been an age line in place, or at least that's what Dumbledore had said. Draco, in his heart of hearts, had breathed a sigh of relief when the rule was announced. Whilst his father had wanted him to enter the tournament, he knew that his magical skills would likely not be able to keep up. Potter competing put everyone on edge for different reasons. Draco and many other underage wizards felt slightly cheated at their potential moment of glory. Potter's friend Ron evidently felt overshadowed by the boy who lived. And Hermione, Draco's girlfriend, damn it, even if they hadn't discussed it. She was on edge because she feared for Potter's safety. Logically, Draco supposed it made sense for her to be worried. She was Potter's friend, and the tournament was dangerous, no matter what reassurances Dumbledore gave. Potter, whose examination scores never came close to Draco's, much less Hermione's, certainly lacked the magical skill necessary to compete. He even looked far younger than the others, barely standing at the same height as Fleur, Draco thought snarkily. At least, if it had been him, Draco would have been as tall as the other boys. However, it wasn't Draco competing, a fact for which he was both fervently jealous and immeasurably relieved. But seeing as Potter had been practically abandoned by his closest ally Ron, and thrown somewhat into this tournament, Hermione felt duty-bound to spend her extra time with him. Draco didn't even have to wear his Slytherin jumper to be positively green with envy. As the Ides of November approached, Draco took comfort in knowing that, at least when this task was over, her time would be his again. Potter would succeed or fail, and not need her help any more, and she could focus on Draco once more. Early December 1994. This tournament had not gone anything like Draco assumed it would. He had assumed that Potter would fail miserably, possibly even spectacularly. He had assumed that everyone and everything would return to normal between him and Hermione after the first task. He was wrong. First came the news articles in the Daily Prophet, romantically linking Hermione with Potter. Draco simmered and stewed along with his potions in Snape's dungeon classroom. Then, in the week or so leading up to the first task, Hermione spent her afternoons and evenings squirreled away in the library or holed up in a classroom, along with Potter practicing. Draco's attitude towards his housemates at the breakfast table was as brittle as a piece of overcooked bacon. Then Potter went and won the first task, and Draco began snapping at his friends like an angry dragon. "What the hell is your problem, Draco?" Theo demanded, after he'd had a nearly full pot of ink levelled at his head one evening in the dormitory. "I only asked what everyone thought the second task in the tournament would be." "I don't wish to talk about that damn tournament. It's all I ever hear about," he grumbled. "Does this have to do with Granger?" The ever-perceptive Pansy piped up, from the floor where she lay on her back, legs propped up against the side of Theo's bed, smoking a lavender and chamomile cigarette. "Sod off, Pans," he said, covering his face with his pillow. "So, yes," said Blaze, blowing pink smoke rings of his own. "All you have to do is talk with her, mate. You don't think I've tried?" Okay, perhaps he hadn't. It was difficult finding her alone nowadays. Even if Potter weren't glued to her side, Hermione had started hiding deep within the stacks of the library. The 1 or 2 times he'd managed to find her, she'd been sitting cozy with Victor Crumb, of all people, and Draco had snuck away, hoping she hadn't seen him. Victor was a puzzle all his own. Draco knew all about Durmstrang's headmaster's checkered history, and his history of revealing the secrets of the Dark Lord, and his allies to the Ministry, in exchange for his freedom. But who was to say that Karkarov's public denouncement of the dark side was truthful? It was entirely plausible that he was still active in the dark arts, and was bringing Victor Crumb into the fold as well. All of Lucius's old warnings and theories about Hermione lingered in the corner of his mind. Over the summer, Lucius has fixated on the identity of her birth parents. What if Hermione was the child of some dark wizard or witch, and had some sort of predilection for the dark arts because of them? And now, with her seeming to develop a connection with the Bulgarian Durmstrang student, Draco had to wonder if Lucius had been right about Richard as well. What if Richard Granger was trying to expand his network of supporters internationally? He had to know what was going on, and he needed to talk to her.
"Hermione, what mean this word?"
The heavy-browed boy turned the book to face her, and pointed at the word on the page. "Oh, aquatic. It means having to do with water, like an ocean or a lake. Does that make sense?"
"Yes, thank you."
Victor smiled at her warmly, and she gave a closed-mouthed smile in return. It was nice, she supposed, having company in the library again. Draco used to sit with her to study in the evenings, until the last month or so, around the time that the tournament had started. But it was clear that he had become jealous of Harry, a patently ridiculous notion. Harry was a friend, it was true, but nothing more. "This looks cosy," a voice drawled. She looked up in surprise. It was as though her thoughts of him had conjured his presence. Draco had rounded the corner, and was leaning against a bookcase of runes texts. His arms were crossed, sleeves rolled up past the elbow, tie unknotted at his throat, the perfect picture of tension. One eyebrow was raised in a knowing expression. "Oh, Draco, I'm glad to see you," she said nervously, although she wasn't sure why she was nervous. "Are you?" He sneered a bit. Yes," she said falteringly. "I need a quick break. Walk with me." Early in the week, Professor McGonagall had announced the upcoming Yule Ball. Though she felt certain that she would attend with Draco, he had not yet asked her. Granted, they had not had much interaction outside of class lately, but she was hoping to resolve that here and now. If he wasn't going to ask her, she would have to ask him. "I wanted to talk to you," she began, smiling shyly at him as they walked side by side between the towering bookcases' aisles. They walked close enough together that their shoulders brushed, but when she looked down to take his hand, she saw that both of his hands were shoved deeply into his pockets.
"Yes, I could tell. What with the fact that you were canoodling with Mr. Bulgarian Quidditch star back there."
She stopped walking abruptly. "What's that supposed to mean?" He turned back to her, sudden and embarrassing tears welling in his eyes. He withdrew one hand from his pocket and swiped at his eyes furiously, shoving his hand back out of sight quickly as he did so.
"It means," he said through clenched teeth, "I thought you were... I thought we were..."
We were! We are!" She corrected herself quickly, but not before his eyes flashed in anger.
"I don't know if you're doing this to advance your father's cause or your own, and I find I don't care."
He turned on his heel and sped away, before she could see the ugly tears on his cheeks. "What is that, Draco?" she called after him, her own throat swelling with sudden emotion. She reached a hand out to him, but he was gone, swallowed up swiftly by the stacks of books. "Draco," she whispered quietly to herself.
"Mini?"
She wiped her eyes quickly, fiercely, on the cuff of her jumper, before turning to face Victor, bright-eyed. "Yes."
"Books Lady Prince say we need to go now. I bring your bag."
But he did not offer the bag for her, instead tilting his head to one side.
"Everything okay?"
"No. Yes, sorry. Just tired is all. Thank you, Victor." She reached a hand out for the bag, but he still did not give it to her.
"I carry for you? Walk you to room?"
he asked haltingly, trying to get the words right. "Sure," she smiled wanly. For the entirety of the walk to Gryffindor Tower, they talked about simple things, as they usually did. Schoolwork and Quidditch and Durmstrang and the weather. He had told her before that he approached her initially to help with his English, but it was obvious that he had some interest in her, she thought. It was unrequited, but appreciated by her at that vulnerable moment. She had never been dumped before. She hadn't even been sure she'd had a boyfriend before she lost him. A part of her felt pleased to know that someone, at least, liked her, even if it wasn't the boy she liked back. They were approaching the fat lady now. Victor stopped and turned to her.
"Hermione, I am hoping you go to ball with me?"
Victor blushed furiously. Well, I was hoping... yes, that would be lovely," she said. She tried very hard to keep the disappointment from her voice. It would be lovely, she chided herself. Draco wasn't going to ask her, and would probably say no if she asked him. And Victor was a nice person. He smiled then, awkwardly, the smile of someone who doesn't smile very often. He took her shoulders in his hands and pulled her to him, giving her a slightly scratchy kiss on the cheek. She inhaled, suddenly in surprise, taking in the unfamiliar scent of his cologne, startling at the feel of stubble on his chin. "Good night," Victor whispered, and moved her bag from his shoulder to hers. He turned and walked quickly back down the corridor. "Balderdash," Hermione said to the portrait numbly, and climbed inside. Draco watched from behind the statue of Caldwell the Cantankerous as Hermione's court shoes disappeared through the portrait hole. He sucked in a ragged breath, and exhaled heavily. He had driven her away with his stupidity. He saw that now. He hoped in his heart of hearts that Hermione didn't like Victor that way. Because no matter what his father said or thought, he truly did not want to think of her as misleading him or acting deviously. Krum, on the other hand, he needed to figure out what Krum's game was, because it was clear the nefarious wizard was trying to get close to Hermione. The only question was, what were his intentions? Draco felt certain they were not honorable. He just wasn't certain if his feelings stemmed from Krum's actions or his own jealousy. Chapter 11. Agonies and Asps. Early December 1994. If Draco felt sure that Victor Krum was up to no good with Hermione, Lucius was doubly sure. When he heard this latest twist from Draco, the girl had thrown him over for Krum. He felt oddly double-crossed. Now that he knew Hermione was likely a pureblood, and the child of the Dark Lord, he had thought, sometimes with happiness and sometimes with horror, of a future marriage contract between the witch and Draco. Whilst it was true they were potentially first cousins, close marriages within families existed, both in wizarding and Muggle history. They wouldn't be the first. But if Krum got there first, establishing an international expansion of Granger's power, Lucius would be left on the outside looking in. Lucius's left arm itched, and he scratched it absent-mindedly through the dark sleeve of his robe. After a moment, he looked down at it and held his arm up, reluctantly pulling up the sleeve to inspect the old dark mark. By the time Draco was 2 or 3 years old, the Dark Lord had been gone for well over a year. Lucius's dark mark had faded considerably to a mottled grey, a hazy shadow of its former self, and it had stayed that way for over a decade. But in the last month or so, it had grown more defined, slightly redder and darker, more raised from the skin, the way it had been years before, during Voldemort's reign. Lucius wondered if Granger's mark looked the same as his. He resolved to write to the man and ask.
Flashback. Early autumn 1994. Peter belched indelicately, smacking his lips loudly, then licking them indecently to catch the last bit of crumbs. It had been a month since he'd arrived at the Riddle house, a month since his belly had tried to digest itself in hunger. The time he had spent here had been glorious. It was true, after more than a dozen years of not using magic, or a fork and knife, for that matter, his skills were rusty. The wands he'd found in the locked wooden box worked well enough for him, but he did not trust his ability to apparate just yet. Still, the village of Little Hangleton offered a couple of small pubs, and his disillusionment charm and imperious curse had not suffered too much of a lag. He had a steady supply of steak and kidney pie, lamb chops and turkey legs, the most buttery mash, grilled asparagus with hollandaise sauce. If he dreamed about it, they would make it for him, packaging it in little tin plates or polystyrene clamshell dishes. Peter sat in his pants and socks with no shirt on, smiling lewdly at the perky blonde model pictured in the Muggle magazine he'd found in the petrol station loo. She was wearing a red bikini and was sunbathing on the deck of a luxurious yacht, surrounded by crystalline aquamarine ocean. The scene was perfection, and it did not take Peter's imagination long to find himself on that yacht, with the lovely woman from the magazine pages. His fingers were still greasy from the fried fish and chips he'd enjoyed a few moments ago, but no matter. He slipped and slid his fingers along his squishy upper arms, imagining that it was her fingers, covered in the suntan oil that she'd used to oil up her own bronzed arms. In Peter's reverie, he and the blonde model kissed sensually, and he moaned there in the darkness of the house at Little Hangleton, caught up in his daydream. "Tiffany, you minx, I love it when you kiss me like this," Peter called out, eyes still closed, raising his hands to his lips and kissing them deeply, imagining the woman's luscious lips on his. Apparently, Tiffany had also been enjoying fish and chips on the yacht. Their kisses turned more urgent, as, in Peter's imagination, he and Tiffany embraced feverishly. He felt and heard the polystyrene clamshell of his fish and chips clatter to the floor, but in that moment, with Tiffany, it did not matter. Then, suddenly, something brushed against his leg. He gasped, giving a girlish, choked little scream, cupping his greasy hands defensively around his elbows. He looked down quickly.
The snake was huge, her head rising between his feet, whilst her body snaked across the room in an S that barely ended at the door, 12 feet or so away. Sitting on the back of the snake, just behind its huge, brutish head, was him. It looked nothing like him, of course, but evil could distinguish evil, and Peter could recognize his master. "My lord," he whispered reverently. "Wormtail." The thing's voice was strangled. "Clean this mess." Late December, 1994. It had been a long autumn and start of winter, just the three of them. The job of milking the snake had fallen to Peter. Peter's fear of the snake was directly correlated to Nagini's distaste of him. Still, their coexistence was a necessary symbiosis. She needed milking, his master needed the venom, and was too weak to do it himself. Voldemort was growing stronger, little by little. Physically, he had nearly tripled in size, now about the size and vague appearance of a small, hairless armadillo without its shell. The sight of him was still repulsive, his skin still raw and red like one huge blister, as though the blood and flesh were barely contained within its translucence. His teeth and eyes protruded from what Peter supposed was meant to be a face. He avoided looking at it when he could. The spindly arms and legs were like those of a sickly, hairless cat, or large bird, all saggy skin and sharp bones and sinew. It was winter again, and Voldemort wasn't ready to venture out, wasn't strong enough yet. But he knew of a spell, a potion, an incantation that could restore him, and Peter was the only wizard available to make this happen. They discussed it at length. He understood what he had to do, reluctant though he was to do it.
It doesn't have to be the enemy, my lord. Only an enemy.
Wormtail, you are nearly useless as a servant to me. Had you only kept yourself hidden from knowing eyes, you could have fetched me the blood easily.
The hairless, toothsome ball of flesh grumbled from its gash of a mouth. Peter flinched as flecks of spittle landed on his hands and face from across the breakfast table. He'd gotten a village lady to fry up some eggs and deliver them with sausages and toast nearly every morning. Voldemort lay on the table across from Peter, nibbling a bit of the sausage and taking away his appetite for food with his gruesome appearance. The Dark Lord continued.
It may not be strong enough without him. However, with Dumbledore protecting him, I do not see a way to get to him. And I do not believe that his Muggle family's blood will have any magic in it. It is useless. But perhaps Dumbledore is the key.
My lord, what do you mean? Peter asked. He did not imagine that getting blood from Dumbledore would be any easier than getting it from Harry Potter.
Albus Dumbledore, too, is well protected, but there is a brother.
Early spring, 1995. The promise and possibility of that brother is how one evening found Peter disguised in a Muggle wig and glasses, operating into the alley behind the Hog's Head Inn in Hogsmeade. An ordered drink, some feigned clumsiness, a precisely broken glass, and, unnoticed as the man fumbled around for a partially clean rag with which to bind the cut, Peter axioed the blood from the barman's suddenly opened finger into a small vial. The blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. Late winter, 1995. Draco was in agony. The past couple of months had been miserable without her. Pansy Parkinson had taken pity on him and offered to go with him to the Yule Ball. He had spent the evening torturing himself, watching Hermione dance, her magical energy overflowing. She was beautiful, resplendent and periwinkle. He brooded in black. This had been followed by more cosy chats between Hermione and Victor in the library. Victor hunkered over the table, pretending not to know words, so that she would help him. Hermione was unable not to answer his question, her kind nature seeing no beguilement. Draco was not above hiding behind the nearby stacks and eavesdropping. He told himself that he was gathering intelligence on a potential covert operative. In truth, he waited, hoping to hear of a disagreement or a chasm between the two. He wanted to hear his own name spoken aloud by her voice. He longed for her to tell Victor to get lost and not come back. Back in January, Hermione had sent them a lovely note, along with a wizarding photograph that did indeed move the way Draco had said they did. In it, Hermione smiled with a closed mouth as she twirled for the camera with Victor. In the crowd behind her, not in focus, a white blonde head could be seen, turning away from the sight. "Oh, look at her dress, Richard! She looks so grown up! I wish we could have been there to see it," Linda said, a bit maudlin but happy for her daughter. At 15, her little girl was growing up. Richard peered down at the photo. "Ah, I thought she said she was going with Draco." Linda pursed her lips together. "Yes, she said that she'd hoped he would ask her, but—" "What, did he get cold feet? Isn't that him, in the back of this picture?" Richard pointed. Linda sighed. "Yes, Narcissa said he was still going, but with an old friend. She wasn't certain either. She thinks they may have had a spat." "Ah, geez, young love, what can you do?" Richard answered, resuming the sports section of his newspaper. The owl known as Colwyn arrived a day or so later. Richard was the one to open the window for the silver owl, clearing a bit of space on the countertop so that the majestic beast could shake the snow carefully from his wings before departing with a bit of Richard's bacon in his beak. "Letter from Narcissa, sir?" Linda asked, coming into the kitchen. Richard frowned. "No, it's from Lucius. He's asking if my mark, my tattoo, I suppose he means, has changed. Why in the world would he be curious about my tattoo?" "Your tattoo, or your tattoos?" Linda asked pointedly, taking the note from his hand. Does he know about both of them?" "Ah, jeez, I hope not. Man alive, this one is all right." He gestured to his arm. "But the other one, let's just say, if anyone but you ever sees that one, we've got a problem." Linda tried and failed to suppress a giggle. "And why is that, Mr. Mouse? I find it rather adorable, myself." "Well, that's because you're a special breed of woman. Most women might consider losing a bet to one's squadron mates and having to get a cartoon mouse tattooed on one's ass cheek to be a bit of a turn-off." My little Granger Danger mouse. You know, perhaps that's why Lucius thought you were a secret agent. Maybe he watched the show years ago, and he has X-ray vision and saw your Danger Mouse tattoo." They looked at each other and laughed. "I don't get the sense, based on Draco's reaction to that film years ago, that they have ever watched any telly in their house," Richard replied dryly. "It's a manner, dear. Get it right," Linda chided. "You're right. I forgot my manners, Lady Linda. They've never watched any telly in their manor," he said, pulling her into his arms and swaying her a bit, as though they were dancing at a fancy gala and not in their breakfast nook. "But, be entirely honest, if I'd had that tattoo when we first got together, would there have been a next date?" Linda considered for a moment, then smiled wickedly. "Well, your ass might say Danger Mouse, but all I see when I look at you is your dashing good looks. And when you look at me with those cobra eyes ready to pounce, grrr," Linda growled with a little smile. "Mrs. Danger Mouse, are you trying to seduce me?" Richard asked in a mock-stricken sounding voice. "Good grief!" They both chuckled and hurried to wash up the breakfast dishes before leaving for work.
That evening, when they returned for their dental practice, Linda dropped their takeout on the breakfast table, noticing the letter from Lucius once again. "Oh, Richard, we were so distracted this morning you forgot to reply to Lucius." She squinted at the note. "Still no idea why he wants to know if your tattoo looks different?" "None. Maybe he's thinking of getting ink himself and wants to know how it will age," Richard said, quickly dashing off a note in reply that he would send later. "Lucius, yes, it has changed a bit over time. I would say it certainly looks different than when I got it years ago. Richard."
Once the leftovers from the take-out dishes were stowed away in the refrigerator, the Grangers watched a film and then got ready for bed. It had been a long day. Linda had dealt with an elderly woman in need of dentures, whilst Richard had done 2 root canals. They both needed some time to unwind. As they lay together in bed, reading, Linda stretched languidly, then turned to look at her husband. "Yes?" Richard drawled, raising his eyes over the top of his book to look at her. "I was just thinking back to what we were talking about this morning. You know, you and those cobra eyes, ready to strike. I thought I might practice my snake-charming techniques on you," she said, with a sly grin. "Well, you don't even need to ask," he smiled, as he put down his book to kiss her. She giggled as she reached over to turn off the bedside lamp. She loved Richard so much, even with his ridiculous jokes. Their marriage had had its ups and downs, as most marriages do. But in all, the good times far outweighed any bad times. It had been, and would continue to be, a good grief indeed. Chapter 12. Jubilation and Jar. Late winter and early spring, 1995. Things got worse between Draco and Hermione before they got better. After the Yule Ball, neither of them were happy, but neither of them could tell the other. It was over, they said to themselves, in that fatalistic way that 15-year-olds think. Hermione tried to like Victor, she really did. She let him kiss her, even if her heart wasn't in it. When he tried to go further, she pushed him away firmly, saying that she wasn't sure she liked him that way, and he accepted this graciously, like a gentleman. Draco went out on a couple of dates that winter with Daphne Greengrass, a vapid sort of girl, tall and willowy, with straight, glossy blonde hair, which was very attractive, if one found that sort of girl attractive. Draco did not, especially. He accompanied Daphne to Hogsmeade for the weekend visit in January, along with a large group of other Slytherins. She was a bit put out that he didn't seem very engaged with her, but he could not help it. He had spotted Hermione and the Three Broomsticks with Potter and Ron Weasley. He spent most of his time sitting in the midst of his group, wondering which of them she had come with. And just before Hermione left the pub, she had a verbal altercation with Rita Skeeter, shit-stirrer extraordinaire. Draco was quite familiar with Skeeter and her work. She had dragged his own father's name through the mud a time or two before. Hermione should know better by now, he thought grimly. Skeeter would do anything to get back at her, if she was able. She didn't even need facts on her side. Just a general baseless whiff of gossip would do. Then in February, Draco sat with Daphne, Theo, Blaise, Pansy, and several others at the second Triwizard Tournament task. Once again, Daphne was clingy, but this time he had no patience for it, shrugging her arm off as she clung to it, shamelessly. They were not really that physical with each other. They had kissed a few times, but it had felt perfunctory and performative. So he had demurred when she tried to kiss him the morning of the second task. "What's wrong, Draco?" she wheedled, as they sat in the stands together, whilst the rules of the task were announced. He didn't answer. His eyes scanned the stands, crowded with spectators, but he wasn't able to find her signature riotous mane anywhere. Surely she hadn't skipped one of the tournament tasks. That seemed unlikely. "Daphne, please, get a clue, I'm begging you," Pansy said, with a deadpan roll of her eyes. "You knew the score going into this. He's taken—" Daphne had huffed and pouted and sneered, but by the 30-minute point of the task, she was cuddled close to Blaise, who had an arm around her. Draco and Blaise had had a wordless conversation in the interim, and all was well between the two wizards. When the shark's head, attached to a pale, thick-set muscular body, emerged from the water holding a wet and slightly panicked Hermione, Draco had flown down the stairs of the stands, prevented from vaulting over the railing to get to the judge's platform, to her, only by the restraining arms of Professor Snape and Professor Moody. She looked up then, burrowed into a blanket by Madame Pomfrey. The lake water clung to her eyelashes, so that she looked tearful, exhausted. And she was exhausted. She had given so much to this tournament, to Harry, and until that moment she'd felt abandoned by Draco. But seeing him there, worry etched upon his face, longing, lunging forward to get to her, to make sure, very sure, that she was safe. It restored her. She smiled up at him, held his silver gaze with her copper one, even as Victor tried to get her attention, even as he reached up to pluck a water beetle from her hair. Late spring, 1995. It had been Professor Moody who had submitted Potter's name for the Triwizard Tournament. He'd used a crude bit of subterfuge, simply submitting Potter's name under a fourth school, making him the only entrant. When questioned by his old friend Dumbledore as to his motives, Alastor Moody simply said that the Dark Lord's followers needed to know who and what they were dealing with. If an untrained 14-year-old, who had famously beaten the Dark Lord as a baby, could compete in and win the Triwizard Tournament, the Death Eaters would think twice about regrouping and returning to their old ways. To that end, Moody had done everything he could to ensure that Potter won the tournament. He pointed Potter in the direction of the dragons for the first task. He convinced Lucius's old elf Dobby to tell Potter about gillyweed for the second task. It had not been enough, however. In the third task, Potter had gotten hopelessly turned around inside the maze. He was fighting off a blast-ended Scroot, and losing, when the maze dissolved because a winner had been declared. The four of them stood there, Victor talking to the Sphinx, Fleur battling a boggart, Harry ducking behind his shield charm against the blast end of the Scroot in question, and Cedric Diggory holding up the Triwizard Tournament Cup in victory. It was a boisterous celebration on the Quidditch pitch as the crowds rushed from the stands to greet the contestants. On the very top corner of the risers, Draco sat with his arm around his witch, snuggling her close against the late evening chill. "Do you want to go down and congratulate them for finishing?" he asked softly. "No, I'm fine where I am, thanks. I'll talk to Harry later, I'm sure." He smiled then, and lowered his lips to hers in a firm kiss, holding her tight against him. He felt her arm wrap around his shoulder, her hand tug on the platinum hair at the nape of his neck. From the bottom of the stands he could make out the catcalls and wolf whistles of Theo and the Weasley twins. They ignored them. As they broke apart, he saw a small green insect crawling along the length of her boot. Let me—" he made as if to wave it away, and her eyes followed it carefully as it flew off. Later, as they walked into the entrance hall, he saw another bug, just like the first one, this time perched upon the back of his Slytherin housemate, Gregory Goyle. Before he could use his thumb and middle finger to flick it away, Hermione pounced upon it, producing a glass jar from her pocket, and snatching up the bug from Goyle's shoulder. "Gotcha!" "What the hell?" Goyle turned around angrily, then saw who it was, panicking slightly. Sorry, Granger. Didn't know it was you." She smiled. "It's all right, Greg." Then the smile slowly slid from her face, and her brows knitted together. Goyle moved down the stairs to the dungeon, and the rest of the students milled about, on their way to their various common rooms for the after-tournament parties. "What's wrong?" Draco asked, worriedly. She didn't say anything at first. He gestured her towards the broom cupboard near the entrance to the great hall. Before the crowd could fade away to the point that they would be noticed going in, they stepped inside. "I don't know why it didn't occur to me before," she began. "What didn't occur to you?" "How the Slytherins treat me." What of it? They don't mistreat you, do they?" "No, that's just it. They don't mistreat me, and I'm not sure why. Do you know, when we first started at Hogwarts, I thought there was some kind of Muggle-born integration program." It was his turn to look confused. "Is that a thing?" "Apparently not. Several of your housemates occasionally bully people, like Justin Finch-Fletchley and Kevin Dintwhistle," she said, a slightly accusatory tone to her voice. Draco racked his brain. Justin he knew from a handful of classes over the years. But who's Kevin Entwistle? "He's a Ravenclaw, about my height, strawberry blonde hair." Draco shook his head, a little lost. Vincent and Greg kept pushing him through the Bloody Baron at the leaving feast last year.
Oh, heavy Kevy.
At this utterance, the angry set of Hermione's mouth went from bad to worse. I'm sure it's mostly baby fat, she said.
Hermione, he's nearly 16.
Still, Slytherins tease both of them mercilessly.
Draco thought for a minute. Maybe it's because you're a girl. They don't want to be mean to you.
It was definitely more of a question than a statement. She was not to be dissuaded. If being a girl was all it took to avoid the bullying of every other Slytherin, then how do you explain Sophie Roper? Now, he really was drawing a blank. He tried to turn the name over in his mind, but nothing was there. He sighed.
I give up. Who is Sophie Roper?
She was a Hufflepuff, a Muggle-born. She moved to the United States at Christmas last year. Hermione's eyes flashed up at him. I think she got tired of the teasing from your house.
Oh,
was all he said, properly chastised. Oh, she said.
Well, I don't exactly know, Hermione. I guess because you're my friend. They don't tease you.
She studied him for a long moment. But why are we friends?
What?
I mean, I know why we're friends now, but why were we friends when we were 11? I've read some of the pure-blood rhetoric, you know. I've heard the stories, found old articles in the Prophet. I know your father used to follow you-know-who.
He took a deep breath and started again. My father was under the Imperious Curse. You, of all people, know those articles don't always print the whole truth.
She looked slightly mollified. That is true, she said, glancing down at her hands where she clutched the glass jar. But why were we friends? Why did your father speak to me and Dad in Flourish and Blotts that day?
I don't know,
Draco said, pulling her close to him to avoid having to look her in the eye, where she might see that he wasn't telling the whole truth.
But I'm glad he did.
He wrapped his arms around her, holding his breath until she finally did the same, snaking her arms around him.
So, are you going to tell me about what this jar is about, or am I going to have to figure it out myself?
Summer, 1995.
His son had been away at school for nearly a year. It took Lucius's breath away now to see how much Draco had grown. 15 now, and the height of a full-grown man, the lean muscles of his arms and torso powerful beneath his skin. His boy cut a lithe, striking figure as he swam laps in the garden pool, along with his friends Theo and Blaise. One night, a day or so later, when his friends had departed, Lucius invited Draco for a fire whiskey in his study. After they had covered the requisite subjects of classes and grades and Quidditch, talk turned to witches, to Hermione.
And how is your friendship with Miss Granger? You seemed rather close at the World Cup last summer.
It was an interesting year. We had our ups and downs, but we're good now.
I'm glad to hear it. Whilst we are on the subject of witches, as you know, ordinarily, when you reach the age of 16, your mother and I would begin putting out solicitations for your betrothal. It is important that we make the most advantageous match, particularly now, Lucius said, scratching idly at his left forearm. Draco lowered his eyes and set his jaw. He knew that this discussion was coming, but it made it no easier. In light of all that, I'm starting to believe that Miss Granger may be a good match for you, Lucius said cautiously. Draco raised his eyebrows in surprise. After a moment, he answered, I've got to say, I'm a bit surprised to hear you say that. Because she is Muggle-born? Draco answered as he sipped his drink. Lucius walked around the desk slowly, coming to sit on the front of it. The more I have considered it, the more I believe she may be pureblood, after all. Now, Draco's brows were nearly touching his hairline. He cleared his throat to avoid coughing and set the drink on the desk. How did you come to that conclusion? We've met her parents. We've eaten dinner in her Muggle house. She was adopted, Draco. I have reason to believe that her mother and father were pureblood wizarding folk.
Draco considered it for a moment in confusion. It seems unusual for a witch or wizard to give up their child, particularly a pureblood one.
It is unusual, yes, but I believe this might be the case for Miss Granger.
Well, I'm not sure what to say. That's great news. Draco took another sip of fire whiskey and smiled to himself. You know, in a similar vein, I started to think that this sorting hat, it put her in the wrong house. Sometimes I think Hermione ought to have been in Slytherin. His son smirked at him, as though letting him in on a private joke.
How so?
You know that reporter, Rita Skeeter, the one always inventing new and elaborate stories about her subject matter?
Ah, yes. I have been featured in some of her creative writing projects over the years.
Lucius ignored the fact that, at least in his case, the writing had been mostly truthful. Well, somehow, Hermione noticed this unusual bug that kept showing up, you see, and the night of the tournament, she had a glass jar, and... Draco lay awake a long time that evening. There was a way forward, then. Over the last few months, he had assumed that, eventually, his mother and father would expect him to break it off with Hermione within another year or two. In pureblood society, courtships typically began around age 16. He might be able to keep a girlfriend for another year or so after beginning a courtship, particularly if his intended witch went to a different school. But he would be expected to marry by the age of 20, and would be expected to remain monogamous, at least until a proper heir was produced. As Draco got older, he found that he did not want that. It seemed romantic, fantastical, but he wished to marry for love. His parents were one of the few pure-blood marriages that he knew to be amicable and loving. Narcissa and Lucius had dated at Hogwarts, and they'd gotten along well, so when their parents sought out a marriage contract, neither of them argued against it. Over the years, Draco knew that his parents had grown to love each other deeply, in spite of their occasional differences. But their marriage was the exception by pureblood wizarding standards, not the rule. And now the same was expected of Draco, he was sure, and Draco had very little experience in fighting expectations. But this information, could it be true? And did it matter if it was or wasn't true? He could have all of it, everything, choice, love, a girlfriend selected by him, because of who she was, not because of what kind of blood ran in her veins. Draco could have her. It made him giddy to think about.
Lucius sat alone in his study, considering the things that Draco had told him, long after Draco had gone to bed. He stared without seeing at the faceted crystal tumbler with its final sip of fire whiskey left untouched inside. He swirled the amber liquid slowly, letting the facets of the glass catch and refract upon the surface of the desk in the low lamplight. The story Draco had just told. Yes, it was true that Lucius, like many others, would have gladly thrown that vile woman from a cliff if given the chance. But to capture and imprison the witch in a jar, that was savage. Not only had she done it, but she had premeditated it. The jar had been charmed to be unbreakable. She had air holes already cut, had kitted it with small bits of food, leaves and twigs, according to Draco. The girl had carried it around in her pocket for weeks, preparing for the chance, ready to strike. It was all very diabolical, calculated. To the watchful eye, whilst Draco spoke of Hermione and Rita Skeeter, Lucius had been proud by association. He had enjoyed the story as Draco had told it, laughing along with his son at Skeeter's comeuppance. He had clapped Draco on the back, congratulating him for finding such a powerful and worthy witch. But inwardly, he was forcibly reminded of another witch he had known, another one with a morbid fascination with weak and defenseless animals. He still remembered how his stomach had churned to hear Narcissa recount the tale of her sister, Bellatrix, and their childhood pet bird. Bellatrix had grown tired of the bird's song, so she put on her father's boot and stepped on the bird. The bird's song was sung no more, and their family never got another pet. But deep inside, Lucius fretted. Yes, Hermione Granger was likely a pureblood, but she was cunning and powerful, so much so that at the age of 11 she had confounded a magical item into placing her within Gryffindor, within striking distance of one of only 2 wizards alive who could oppose the Dark Lord's resurgence. Who else would she strike down if they angered her? If Draco or Lucius got in her way, would she destroy them? And the most chilling thought of all, yes, the predilection for violence might be born from her blood, but her craft had been honed, her weaponized bloodthirst sharpened at the whetstone of her mother and father. She had not, after all, sprung fully formed from nothing. She had been raised in the malevolent world of Muggles, by the very definition of depravity, a Muggle Death-Eater and his assassin wife. Hermione Granger was the worst of both worlds, a blade sharpened at both ends.
Thank you for listening to The Muggle Death-Eater and His Daughter by Great78. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to more, please subscribe to me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts at Silver and Copper, or search Great78 on Archive of Our Own.